In the early 1970s, the world believed it was firmly on a path of modern growth, expanding prosperity, and unstoppable technological progress. Economies across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia were experiencing rapid development. Energy, particularly oil, was abundant, cheap, and widely assumed to remain so indefinitely. The post-World War Roman II international system, shaped by the Bretton Woods institutions and a confident United States, appeared stable. Industrialization was accelerating across the globe, from West Germany to Japan, and the economic expansion of the post-war era seemed to have no foreseeable end. But beneath this facade of stability lay a series of tensions, geopolitical rivalries, economic imbalances, and shifting power dynamics that would soon converge into one of the most consequential events in modern history, the 1973 oil crisis. This crisis did not emerge out of nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of growing control by Western oil companies over Middle Eastern resources, rising nationalism in oil-producing nations, the geopolitical stakes of the Cold War, and deepening frustrations across the Arab world regarding Western support for Israel during the Arab-Israeli conflicts. All of these forces were set against the backdrop of a rapidly expanding global demand for oil, especially in industrialized nations that had grown accustomed to low energy prices as a foundation of economic growth. The events of 1973 would reveal just how fragile that foundation truly was. To understand how the crisis unfolded and why its impact was so profound, we must first step back in time to the decades preceding it. After World War Roman II, the world economy experienced an extraordinary boom. Nations rebuilt their industries, populations grew, and consumer lifestyles expanded rapidly. Automobiles, air travel, massive manufacturing output, suburbanization, global trade networks, and modern agriculture all relied on one essential ingredient: oil. It became the lifeblood of modern civilization. By 1970, global oil consumption had more than tripled compared to the years immediately following the war, and projections confidently assumed this upward trend would continue indefinitely. For much of the mid-20th century, the price of oil was kept remarkably low. Private Western oil companies, referred to collectively as the Seven Sisters, dominated the global supply chain. These included giants like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, BP, Shell, and Gulf Oil. They managed production, refined crude, set prices, and ensured that the Western industrial world had access to inexpensive energy. But while consumers in the United States and Europe enjoyed cheap gasoline and heating oil, producing nations in the Middle East grew increasingly resentful. They saw their natural resources being extracted at prices they considered unfair, often for the benefit of foreign corporations and governments. Out of this frustration emerged the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, founded in 1960 in Baghdad by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Its purpose was to unify and coordinate the petroleum policies of member states, allowing them to negotiate collectively with the powerful oil companies. Over the next decade, OPEC gradually expanded its influence, but it had not yet demonstrated the full extent of its power. That would change dramatically in the early 1970s. By 1973, the geopolitical climate in the Middle East was growing increasingly tense. The Arab-Israeli conflict remained unresolved, tensions simmered, and diplomatic efforts often collapsed. When the Yom Kippur War broke out in October of that year, with Egypt and Syria launching a coordinated attack against Israel, the world was thrust into yet another Middle Eastern conflict. The United States, committed to supporting Israel, began providing military aid. In retaliation, Arab members of OPEC, acting through the newly formed OPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to use oil as a political weapon. The decision was unprecedented. Arab oil producers would impose an embargo on nations supporting Israel drastically cut production, and sharply raise prices. For the first time in modern history, oil-producing nations exerted direct, decisive leverage over global energy markets. This was not merely a temporary disruption in supply, it was a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The effects were immediate and far-reaching. In the United States, long lines formed at gasoline stations as shortages spread across the country. Motorists waited for hours, sometimes only to find that fuel had run out. Many gas stations began imposing limits, and some closed entirely on designated days. State and federal governments introduced measures such as rationing plans, speed limit reductions, and restrictions on driving. For a nation that had long taken plentiful, cheap gasoline for granted, the shock was profound. Meanwhile, in Europe and Japan, highly dependent on imported oil and lacking domestic reserves, the consequences were even more severe. Energy prices soared, inflation surged, and industrial output contracted. Countries scrambled to secure alternative supplies, diversify energy sources, and implement conservation strategies. The global economy, which had enjoyed decades of robust growth, was suddenly plunged into instability. Inflation combined with recession to create a phenomenon known as stagflation, a term that would come to define the economic struggles of the 1970s. But the crisis was more than an economic shock. It was a geopolitical turning point. For decades, Western nations had assumed they held the dominant influence over the Middle East and its resources. The 1973 embargo shattered that assumption. OPEC nations demonstrated not only their collective power, but also their willingness to use it to advance political objectives. The West, accustomed to dictating terms, now found itself dependent on the decisions of oil-producing nations. In the United States, the crisis prompted a re-evaluation of energy policy on a scale not seen before. President Richard Nixon introduced the concept of Project Independence, drawing inspiration from the spirit of the earlier political independence movement. The goal was to reduce reliance on foreign oil, increase domestic production, develop alternative energy sources, and promote energy efficiency. Although the project did not achieve its most ambitious goals, it marked the beginning of a long-term shift in American energy policy and sparked investments in new technologies and infrastructure. Elsewhere in the world, nations pursued their own strategies. France accelerated its development of nuclear power, eventually becoming one of the most nuclear-dependent countries in the world. Japan launched initiatives to reduce energy intensity and diversify its supply chain. European nations strengthened cooperation and developed mechanisms such as the International Energy Agency (IEA), founded in 1974 to coordinate energy policies among industrialized countries. The crisis, in effect, laid the foundation for global energy governance structures that still exist today. However, perhaps the most significant transformation occurred within the oil-producing nations themselves. The sudden surge in oil prices brought unprecedented wealth to countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and others. With this wealth came global influence. Petrodollar revenues funded massive infrastructure projects, urban development, modernization programs, and, increasingly, sovereign wealth funds that would later become major players in global finance. The geopolitical weight of the Middle East grew dramatically, and the era of oil-fueled power had firmly begun. To understand how all of this unfolded, we need to explore the crisis not simply as a singular event, but as the intersection of numerous historical forces. It involved the politics of the Cold War, the economics of global supply chains, the cultural tensions of post-colonial nationalism, and the technological evolution of industrial society. The story of the 1973 oil crisis is a story about how energy shapes the world and what happens when that energy is disrupted. As we move deeper into this documentary, we will uncover the layers behind the crisis, The long history of Western involvement in Middle Eastern oil fields, the birth and evolution of OPEC, the geopolitical dynamics leading up to the Yom Kippur War, the internal debates among Arab leaders, the reactions of Western governments, the economic collapse that followed, and the long-term consequences that are still felt today. We will examine how the crisis reshaped global economics, altered the strategies of nations, and changed the very architecture of the international system. But before we explore the dramatic months of 1973, we must first understand how oil became so central to modern civilization. The events of the crisis make far more sense when viewed in the context of the 20th century transformation of energy, industry, and global power. Oil is unique in its energy density, versatility, and ease of transport. Compared to coal, it offers superior efficiency. Compared to other fossil fuels, it enabled innovations like the internal combustion engine, modern transportation systems, petrochemicals, plastics, and countless industrial processes. By the mid-20th century, oil was woven into nearly every aspect of daily life, from heating and electricity to consumer goods, agriculture, aviation, and global trade. This dependency created vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities would be exposed dramatically when supply was suddenly restricted. Moreover, oil is not evenly distributed around the planet. Large reserves exist in specific regions, most notably the Middle East. This geographic concentration created strategic dependencies that shaped foreign policy decisions for decades. For industrialized nations, maintaining access to Middle Eastern oil became a central national interest. As a result, the region became a focal point of international diplomacy, military strategy, and economic policy. The Seven Sisters, the powerful Western oil corporations, played a central role in shaping this system. Through concessions, agreements, and relationships with local rulers, they secured long-term access to vast oil fields at prices favorable to Western economies. Producing countries had limited control over pricing, extraction, or export volumes. Although some adjustments were made over time, especially during renegotiations in the 1950s and early 1960s, the fundamental imbalance remained. Against this backdrop, the rise of OPEC was an assertion of sovereignty. It represented a collective effort by oil-producing nations to reclaim control over their natural resources. The organization grew in membership and influence, but in its early years, it did not fully challenge the dominance of Western oil companies. That began to change in the late 1960s and early 1970s as new leaders emerged in the Middle East, nationalism surged, and global energy demand continued its rapid rise. The stage was set for confrontation. But no one, neither Western governments nor oil companies, anticipated the scale of what was about to happen. The idea that a group of producing nations could successfully restrict oil supplies and dictate prices seemed unthinkable. Yet that is exactly what unfolded, and the world would never be the same. As the world entered the early 1970s, the international political landscape was shifting in subtle but important ways. The United States, though still the dominant global superpower, was dealing with the economic and political consequences of the Vietnam War. The costs of prolonged military involvement had strained federal budgets and contributed to inflationary pressures. Domestic confidence in political leadership was waning, especially as the Watergate scandal began to unfold. Meanwhile, Europe was rebuilding its post-war identity, integrating economically, and redefining its relationship with both the United States and the broader global order. Japan, for its part, was experiencing one of the fastest economic growth periods in modern history, transforming from a war-ravaged nation into a major industrial powerhouse, heavily reliant on imported energy. At the same time, the Bretton Woods monetary system, which had underpinned the post-war economic order, was unraveling. In 1971, President Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, a move that effectively ended the fixed exchange rate system. This decision, known as the Nixon shock, sent ripple effects throughout the global economy. Currency fluctuations became more volatile, trade imbalances grew more complex, and economic predictability diminished. For oil-producing countries, the depreciation of the US dollar meant that the value of their oil revenues, which were priced almost exclusively in dollars, began to decline in real terms. This fueled growing resentment within OPEC nations, who saw their purchasing power eroding even as global demand for oil soared. These economic conditions increased OPEC's incentive to assert more control over pricing. The organization began renegotiating agreements with Western oil companies, pushing for higher revenues and greater national ownership of resources. Several countries, such as Libya and Algeria, made significant progress in securing improved terms. Others followed suit, gradually shifting the balance of power from multinational corporations to national governments. Yet even with these gains, few in the West recognized how powerful OPEC could become if it acted collectively. Meanwhile, tensions in the Middle East continued to escalate. The Six-Day War in 1967 had reshaped the region, leaving Israel in control of territories such as the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Arab nations, particularly Egypt and Syria, were determined to reclaim these lands. Diplomatic negotiations had stalled, and the region remained a flashpoint for conflict. The United States, seen by Arab nations as the principal supporter of Israel, was viewed with increasing suspicion and hostility. The Arab members of OPEC watched closely, understanding that their role as oil suppliers had the potential to influence geopolitical outcomes. As 1973 approached, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Syrian President Hafez al-Assad began preparing for a strategic military operation aimed at reclaiming lost territory. The plan was to launch a surprise attack during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, catching Israeli defenses off guard. The success of the initial offensive shocked Israel and its allies, prompting rapid military responses. The United States, just as expected, moved to supply Israel with weapons and critical support. This decision would become the trigger for one of the most dramatic economic retaliations in modern history. On October 17, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC announced a complete oil embargo against the United States and other nations that supported Israel, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. They also initiated coordinated production cuts and price increases. For the first time, oil was explicitly linked to geopolitical demands. The message was clear: support Israel, and you will pay the price through your energy supply. The impact was immediate and staggering. Within weeks, the price of crude oil quadrupled. This was not a simple market fluctuation, but a deliberate restructuring of the global energy economy. For decades, oil prices had been kept artificially low by Western companies. Now, oil-producing nations were reclaiming their role not only as suppliers, but as strategic decision-makers, influencing global economics. The United States found itself facing an energy crisis unlike anything in its history. The country had built its post-war prosperity on cheap oil. Suburbs expanded, highways stretched across the nation, automobiles became essential to daily life, and industries grew increasingly energy-intensive. By 1973, domestic oil production had peaked, and the country had transitioned from a net exporter to a net importer of oil. The assumption that foreign supply would always be abundant proved disastrously wrong. Gasoline shortages rippled across the nation. Long lines at gas stations became a daily reality. Some states implemented odd-even rationing, allowing drivers to purchase gasoline only on certain days based on their license plate numbers. Speed limits were reduced to conserve fuel. The federal government debated rationing programs, and energy conservation became a national priority. For many Americans, The crisis symbolized a sudden and unsettling loss of control over their economic future. In Western Europe, the situation was even more precarious. Countries like the Netherlands, which had openly supported Israel, faced particularly severe embargo restrictions. The Netherlands saw its oil supplies dramatically reduced, prompting shutdowns of factories and restrictions on electricity usage. Countries that relied heavily on imported oil, such as Italy, France, and West Germany, scrambled to negotiate with Arab states, reconfigure energy policies, and manage rising inflation. The crisis exposed the vulnerability of industrial economies that had grown dependent on a resource largely controlled by a small number of foreign nations. Japan, whose economic miracle had been built on imported energy, faced one of the most significant shocks of all. With virtually no domestic oil reserves, Japan relied overwhelmingly on Middle Eastern imports. The embargo threatened to derail the country's rapid industrial expansion. Japanese leaders quickly moved to strengthen diplomatic ties with Arab nations, adapt their energy strategies, and promote technological innovation aimed at reducing oil intensity. Over time, this crisis would accelerate Japan's investment in efficiency and renewable technologies, helping it become one of the most energy-efficient economies in the world. The economic effects of the 1973 oil crisis were not limited to energy shortages. Inflation surged across much of the industrialized world as the rising price of oil increased production costs for virtually every sector. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and consumer goods all became more expensive. Governments struggled to manage the simultaneous challenges of inflation and unemployment, leading to the dreaded condition known as stagflation. Traditional economic policies seemed inadequate. Monetary tightening, intended to curb inflation, risked worsening unemployment. Expansionary policies, meant to stimulate growth, threatened to drive inflation even higher. The crisis forced economists and governments to rethink many core assumptions about growth, inflation, and monetary policy. The global financial system also faced upheaval. Oil revenues, now dramatically larger thanks to higher prices, poured into the coffers of OPEC nations. These funds, often referred to as petrodollars, were deposited into Western banks, which then lent them to developing countries. This process, known as petrodollar recycling, reshaped global finance in ways that would have long-term consequences. Many developing nations took on substantial debt during this period, hoping to invest in growth and modernization. However, when interest rates rose sharply in the late 1970s and early 1980s, these debts became unsustainable, contributing to the global debt crisis that would follow. The dramatic shift in global economic power also forced Western nations to reconsider their foreign policy strategies. Access to energy became a central national security concern. Military presence in the Middle East expanded. Diplomatic relationships grew increasingly centered on maintaining stability in oil-producing regions. The United States, in particular, reshaped its engagement with Saudi Arabia, strengthening political, economic, and military ties. This relationship would become one of the defining features of American foreign policy for decades to come. The crisis also accelerated efforts to diversify energy sources and improve energy efficiency. Although many industrialized nations continued to rely heavily on oil, they began exploring alternatives such as nuclear power, natural gas, coal, and eventually renewable technologies. Governments implemented conservation measures, encouraged technological innovation, and developed long-term strategies to reduce vulnerability to supply disruptions. Environmental awareness grew, though in 1973 it was still in its early stages. Over time, the crisis would contribute to a broader understanding of the importance of sustainable energy systems. But what made the 1973 oil crisis particularly transformative was not just the immediate economic disruption or the dramatic rise in energy prices. It was the fundamental shift in power dynamics between oil producers and consumers. OPEC nations, especially those in the Middle East, emerged as key actors on the global stage. They demonstrated that by acting collectively, they could influence the world economy in ways previously unimaginable. For Western powers accustomed to dominance in international affairs, this was a humbling and sobering realization. Arab nations, for their part, celebrated the newfound leverage. The embargo was seen as a long-overdue assertion of sovereignty and political influence. It signaled that the era of Western control over Middle Eastern resources was ending. It also revealed the potential for economic tools, specifically energy, to shape geopolitical outcomes. Although the embargo itself was lifted in March 1974, the shock it delivered to the global system would reverberate for decades. In analyzing the deeper causes of the crisis, it becomes clear that the embargo was not merely a reaction to the Yom Kippur War. It was the culmination of growing frustrations within the Arab world, rising nationalism, dissatisfaction with Western involvement in regional politics, and long-term grievances about the management of natural resources. The war served as the immediate catalyst, but the political, economic, and historical roots of the crisis ran far deeper. The embargo also revealed the interconnectedness of global systems. A regional geopolitical conflict triggered an economic shock that impacted every major industrialized nation. Supply chains were disrupted, markets faltered, and currencies fluctuated. The crisis highlighted the degree to which modern societies depend on global flows of energy, trade, and finance. It also underscored the vulnerability inherent in that dependence, prompting many nations to rethink their energy strategies and foreign policies. To understand the magnitude of the 1973 oil crisis, it is necessary to explore both the internal dynamics within OPEC and the broader geopolitical environment that made such a dramatic move possible. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, OPEC's internal cohesion was steadily strengthening. Many member states had undergone political transformations that made them more assertive in their negotiations with Western companies. Leaders emerged who viewed control over natural resources as central to national sovereignty, identity, and development. Countries like Libya under Muammar Gaddafi and Iraq under the Ba'ath Party took aggressive stances in their dealings with the oil majors, pushing for higher prices and greater national participation in extraction and refining. Meanwhile, global energy demand continued to rise. Industrial expansion across Europe and Japan was driving consumption to new heights. The United States, long accustomed to plentiful domestic production, saw its oil output decline after reaching its peak in 1970. This shift was significant. It marked the moment when the world's largest economy began relying heavily on imported oil. In earlier decades, disruptions in the Middle East had mattered less to the United States because domestic reserves were sufficient to maintain stability. Now, however, any major disturbance in global supply would directly affect American consumers and industries. This increased vulnerability was not fully recognized by policymakers at the time. Oil scarcity was not the only factor driving tensions. The Cold War created a geopolitical landscape in which both superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, sought influence in the Middle East. American support for Israel was a point of deep contention for Arab nations, while the Soviet Union backed several Arab states, including Egypt and Syria. This division complicated diplomatic efforts, fueled regional rivalries, and contributed to a climate in which the idea of using oil as a political weapon gained traction. Arab leaders recognized that oil could serve not only as an economic resource, but also as leverage in the wider geopolitical struggle. The decision to impose the embargo was not made lightly. Arab nations had debated the use of oil as a political tool for years. During the Six-Day War in 1967, some attempts were made to use oil as leverage. but they were largely ineffective because the producing countries lacked the coordination and unity needed to influence markets. By 1973, however, the situation was different. OPEC had matured into a more cohesive organization, and the Arab members, acting through OPEC, had specific political demands tied to the war. They believed that the time had come to assert their influence. When the embargo was announced, many Western officials initially dismissed its seriousness. Oil companies and government agencies believed they could rely on existing reserves, alternative producers, or diplomatic pressure to mitigate the impact. But the scale of the production cuts and the political resolve behind the embargo quickly made it clear that this was not a temporary disruption. It was a fundamental challenge to the global energy system. As panic spread, oil-consuming nations realized that they had little recourse. Production cuts reached approximately 5 million barrels a day, about 7% of global supply. Most Western nations lacked strategic petroleum reserves at the time. They were unprepared to manage shortages. The crisis highlighted the fragility of a system that had taken stable supply for granted. Industrial output began declining almost immediately. Factories dependent on petroleum-based processes faced reduced production schedules or temporary shutdowns. Transportation networks slowed as fuel became scarce. Airlines reduced flights. Agriculture, which relied heavily on petroleum-based fertilizers, machinery, and transportation, saw costs surge. Rising prices spread through the economy like shockwaves. One of the most dramatic consequences was the surge in inflation. Oil prices quadrupled from around $3 per barrel to nearly $12 per barrel. This sudden increase fed into the cost of nearly all goods and services. At the same time, economic contraction limited employment and productivity, creating conditions ripe for stagflation. Traditional macroeconomic tools offered limited options, and policymakers struggled to adapt. The crisis challenged the foundations of post-war economic thinking, setting the stage for major ideological shifts in the years to come. The crisis also transformed domestic politics in many Western nations. In the United States, the long lines at gas stations and the visible economic strain contributed to a sense of national malaise. President Nixon's administration implemented various measures aimed at reducing consumption, including the creation of the 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit and efforts to promote energy conservation. Discussions of rationing became widespread, though large-scale rationing was never fully implemented. The crisis also spurred the establishment of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975, designed to provide a buffer against future supply disruptions. In Europe, governments responded with a mix of rationing, conservation campaigns, and new energy policies. Many nations temporarily banned Sunday driving, reduced heating in public buildings, and limited industrial energy use. The crisis accelerated cooperation among European countries, contributing to the development of coordinated energy strategies and institutions that would later play a role in European integration. Japan's response was notable for its speed and effectiveness. Recognizing the existential threat posed by its dependence on imported oil, Japan quickly implemented energy efficiency measures, diversified its energy mix, and intensified its investment in nuclear power. Japanese industries adopted new technologies to reduce energy consumption, helping to turn the crisis into an opportunity for long-term competitiveness. Over time, Japan became a global leader in energy-efficient manufacturing and technology, a legacy that continues today. While the crisis forced major industrialized nations to rethink their energy strategies, it also ushered in a period of economic transformation within oil-producing countries. The enormous surge in revenues enabled ambitious development programs across the Middle East. Cities such as Riyadh, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait City began modernizing at an unprecedented pace. Infrastructure projects expanded rapidly, Highways, airports, hospitals, universities, and entire urban districts were built using petrodollar funding. Sovereign wealth funds emerged as powerful investment entities, accumulating vast portfolios of global assets. For many Arab nations, the crisis represented a turning point in their global identity. Oil wealth brought not only prosperity, but also geopolitical influence. Leaders in the region gained a stronger voice in international affairs. Diplomatic relations with Western nations became more balanced as both sides recognized their mutual dependence. The crisis demonstrated that the global economic order was not fixed. It could be reshaped by the decisions of countries outside the traditional centers of power. Yet the crisis also exposed vulnerabilities within oil-producing nations. Their economies became heavily dependent on oil revenues, creating a reliance that would later challenge diversification efforts. Wealth disparities grew in some countries as rapid development benefited certain groups more than others. Political tensions emerged within OPEC as members debated production levels, pricing strategies, and national interests. The organization had demonstrated its power, but unity would not always be easy to maintain. The crisis also had deep cultural impacts. In many Western nations, the shock of the embargo challenged assumptions about economic growth, energy consumption, and the role of natural resources. The post-war optimism that had characterized the 1950s and 1960s gave way to a more cautious and uncertain outlook. Environmental awareness gained momentum as people began questioning the sustainability of fossil fuel dependence. Although environmental movements predated the crisis, the events of 1973 amplified concerns about resource scarcity and ecological limits. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the crisis was the recognition of energy as a strategic sector requiring coordinated policy. Governments began developing comprehensive energy strategies that included diversification, conservation, technological innovation, and geopolitical planning. The International Energy Agency, IEA, was created in 1974 to provide a forum for coordinated responses among oil-consuming nations. Its role included managing strategic reserves, analyzing market data, and developing emergency policies. The IEA became a central institution in global energy governance and remains influential today. The crisis also had important implications for the global South. Many developing nations, already struggling with economic challenges, faced rising costs for energy imports. The increased cost of oil strained national budgets, contributed to inflation, and exacerbated trade imbalances. Some countries took on debt to cope with rising costs, only to face severe financial difficulties later in the decade. The petrodollar recycling process, wherein Western banks lent OPEC revenues to developing nations, eventually contributed to the debt crisis of the 1980s. Thus, the 1973 oil crisis inadvertently shaped the economic trajectory of dozens of countries far removed from the Middle East. From a geopolitical standpoint, the crisis altered alliances and reshaped strategic priorities. The United States increased its military presence in the Persian Gulf, recognizing the region's growing importance for global stability. European nations pursued closer diplomatic ties with Arab states, often balancing their historical relationships with their new energy dependencies. The Soviet Union, too, saw opportunities to expand its influence in the region, though its impact remained limited compared to that of OPEC and Western powers. Although the embargo officially ended in 1974, its effects lingered long afterward. Oil prices remained high throughout the decade, contributing to ongoing economic instability. Energy policies across the world continued to evolve in response to the new realities. The crisis had fundamentally altered the global landscape, demonstrating that energy could be used as a tool of geopolitical influence and that control over resources could reshape international power dynamics. As the immediate shock of the 1973 oil crisis reverberated across the world, governments, economists, and industries began to confront a stark reality. The era of cheap, stable oil was over. The assumptions that had guided economic planning, national policies, and global trade since the end of World War II were suddenly obsolete. A fundamental transition was underway, and no country could avoid its consequences. To understand the deeper significance of the crisis, it is essential to examine how it reshaped global economics, altering everything from inflation and employment to industrial strategy and financial systems. In the early months of 1974, as countries scrambled to adapt, economists searched for explanations and solutions to the unprecedented economic conditions they were facing. Traditional economic models had long assumed that inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions. This belief was rooted in the Phillips curve, a concept suggesting that policymakers could trade off higher inflation for lower unemployment or vice versa. But the oil crisis shattered this assumption. Inflation soared even as industrial output slowed and unemployment rose. Economists were faced with a phenomenon they had previously considered rare or theoretical: stagflation. Stagflation baffled policymakers because it did not respond predictably to either expansionary or contractionary policies. Trying to stimulate the economy risked driving inflation even higher, while tightening monetary policy to curb inflation threatened to worsen unemployment and economic stagnation. Many economists began questioning the validity of Keynesian models that had dominated post-war economic thinking. This intellectual crisis would eventually contribute to the rise of new economic paradigms, including monetarism and supply-side economics. The crisis played a significant role in shifting economic policy debates throughout the Western world. Meanwhile, industries dependent on oil faced rising costs that forced them to change their operations. Manufacturing plants reduced production or sought alternative energy sources. Automotive companies, particularly in the United States, faced growing pressure to improve fuel efficiency. Detroit's Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, had built their success on large, fuel-intensive vehicles that were suddenly less appealing to consumers burdened by fuel shortages and rising gasoline prices. Japanese automakers, known for producing smaller and more fuel-efficient cars, gained a competitive advantage and began capturing significant market share in the United States and Europe. This marked a turning point in the global automotive industry and reshaped consumer expectations for decades to come. Air travel also experienced significant disruption. Jet fuel prices soared, forcing airlines to reduce routes, increase ticket prices, and adopt more efficient aircraft technologies. The dramatic increase in energy costs contributed to a broader reassessment of global transportation networks. Shipping costs rose, affecting international trade patterns and prompting companies to reconsider supply chains that had become increasingly globalized in the post-war era. In many ways, the oil crisis revealed the vulnerabilities of a world heavily dependent on long-distance transportation and energy-intensive logistics. Agriculture, too, felt the impact. Modern farming had become highly mechanized, relying on fuel for tractors, irrigation systems, and food transportation. Fertilizers, many of which are derived from petroleum products, became more expensive. Food prices rose as a result, contributing to inflation and placing additional burdens on consumers already struggling with rising costs across the board. Developing nations were hit hardest as higher food prices and increased costs for energy imports strained national budgets and threatened food security. The crisis also triggered significant financial shifts. As oil prices rose, OPEC nations accumulated vast amounts of revenue. These funds were deposited into Western banks, creating large pools of capital that needed to be reinvested. Banks, eager to profit from the influx of petrodollars, began lending aggressively to developing nations. Many of these countries, facing rising energy costs and slow economic growth, saw borrowing as a means to finance development, industrialization, or simply to stabilize their economies. For a time, this system functioned smoothly, but the long-term consequences would be severe. When interest rates rose sharply later in the decade, many developing nations found themselves unable to service their debts. The resulting debt crisis of the 1980s can be traced, in part, to the financial dynamics created by the 1973 oil crisis. On a geopolitical level, the crisis strengthened the position of oil-producing nations, particularly those in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia emerged as the most influential member of OPEC, thanks to its enormous reserves and its willingness to adjust production levels to stabilize markets. Its relationship with the United States grew deeper and more complex in the aftermath of the crisis. While the embargo had dealt a blow to American economic confidence, it also prompted both nations to recognize their mutual interdependence. In the years that followed, the United States and Saudi Arabia developed a strategic partnership centered on energy, military cooperation, and regional stability. The Middle East, enriched by petrodollars, began undergoing rapid modernization. Infrastructure projects transformed cities almost overnight. Governments invested in education, healthcare, housing, and economic development. However, the influx of wealth also brought challenges. Rising expectations among the population, disparities in wealth distribution, and increased dependence on oil revenues that made national economies vulnerable to price fluctuations. These internal dynamics created complex social and political pressures that would manifest differently across the region in subsequent decades. The crisis also influenced the internal dynamics of OPEC. While the organization had demonstrated its ability to coordinate effectively during the embargo, maintaining unity proved difficult in the long run. Member nations differed in their political priorities, economic structures, and production capacities. Some sought higher prices, while others prioritized stable markets. Over time, these differences would challenge OPEC's ability to influence global markets as effectively as it had in 1973. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the crisis was its influence on energy policy and environmental awareness. Governments around the world began to reconsider the sustainability of their energy systems. In the United States, the crisis led to the creation of the Department of Energy in 1977 and spurred investments in alternative energy research. Solar and wind technologies, though still in their infancy, gained new attention. Nuclear power expanded rapidly in several countries, especially in France, which pursued an aggressive strategy to reduce its dependence on oil. By the 1980s, France had built one of the world's largest nuclear energy programs, drawing heavily on lessons learned from the crisis. Energy efficiency became a key focus of industrial policy. Companies invested in technologies that reduced energy consumption, improved manufacturing processes, and minimized waste. Building designs incorporated better insulation and heating systems. Governments introduced fuel economy standards for automobiles, encouraged the use of public transportation, and promoted conservation efforts among households. Many of these measures laid the groundwork for the environmental policies that would emerge in later decades. The crisis also catalyzed the development of strategic petroleum reserves. Recognizing the risks of overdependence on foreign oil, nations began storing large quantities of crude oil to provide a buffer against future supply disruptions. The United States established its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, while European and Asian nations developed their own stockpiles. These reserves became critical tools for managing energy security and stabilizing markets during later crises. Another significant outcome of the crisis was the shift in public attitudes toward energy consumption. The abundance of cheap oil had fostered a culture of consumption that ignored the limits of natural resources. The 1973 crisis served as a wake-up call, prompting individuals and governments to think more critically about energy use. Although conservation efforts varied across different countries, the crisis helped instill a greater awareness of the need for sustainable resource management. Despite its disruptions, the crisis also sparked innovation. Industries that were forced to adapt often emerged stronger and more efficient. New technologies were developed to reduce reliance on oil, improve energy efficiency, and diversify energy sources. These innovations would play important roles in the decades that followed, particularly as concerns about climate change grew. Politically, the crisis reshaped alliances and strategic priorities. The Middle East became more central to global geopolitics than ever before. Western nations, particularly the United States, increased their involvement in the region to ensure the stability of oil supplies. This involvement would shape foreign policy decisions for decades, influencing everything from military deployments to diplomatic strategies. The crisis also highlighted the importance of maintaining strong relationships with key producing nations, leading to long-term commitments and partnerships that persist to this day. For many developing nations, however, the crisis deepened economic vulnerabilities. Rising energy costs strained budgets and contributed to inflation, debt, and economic instability. Countries that lacked diversified economies were particularly hard hit. The crisis underscored the global inequalities inherent in the energy system and fueled debates about the need for more equitable economic development. Although the embargo ended in 1974, the crisis fundamentally altered the global economic landscape. Oil prices remained high, economic challenges persisted, and energy policies continued to evolve. The experience of 1973 served as a reminder that the global economy was deeply interconnected and that disruptions in one sector could trigger far-reaching consequences. It also demonstrated the power of collective action by resource-rich nations and highlighted the importance of energy security as a central component of national strategy. By the mid-1970s, the effects of the 1973 oil crisis were still unfolding across every continent. Although the embargo itself had ended, its consequences continued to ripple through global economies, political systems, and social structures. Nations realized that they had entered a new era, one defined by energy uncertainty, geopolitical realignment, and economic instability. To fully appreciate the crisis's lasting impact, it is necessary to explore how governments, markets, and societies adapted to this transformed landscape. One of the most significant long-term effects of the crisis was the shift in global economic leadership. Before 1973, the United States and Western Europe had dominated global industry, trade, and finance. Japan had risen rapidly, but was still building its international profile. After the crisis, the economic influence of oil-producing nations grew dramatically. These nations, with their newly acquired wealth, began investing heavily in global markets, purchasing assets, financing development projects, and shaping the global financial system through their sovereign wealth funds. The rise of the petrostates introduced new players into the world economy, creating a more multipolar economic environment. During this period, Western economies struggled with the dual challenges of inflation and slow growth. Many countries saw their manufacturing sectors weaken under the combined pressure of higher energy costs and increased international competition. This spurred debates about industrial policy, protectionism, and the need for structural reform. Some industries adapted successfully, while others declined, contributing to long-term shifts in employment patterns, urban development, and trade relationships. Meanwhile, the crisis prompted governments to take a more active role in managing energy policy. In the United States, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 introduced fuel economy standards for vehicles, a measure that would have lasting impacts on automotive design. Public awareness campaigns encouraged citizens to reduce energy consumption by lowering thermostats, carpooling, and improving home insulation. These efforts marked the beginning of a broader shift toward energy awareness that would continue to grow in the decades that followed. In Western Europe, the crisis strengthened the resolve to pursue energy diversification and integration. European nations recognized that cooperation was essential for managing shared energy vulnerabilities. The European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union, intensified efforts to coordinate energy policy. Countries invested in nuclear power, natural gas infrastructure, and alternative energy research. The crisis acted as a catalyst for initiatives that would eventually contribute to the development of the European single market and later climate and energy frameworks. Japan emerged as one of the most remarkable examples of adaptation. Faced with severe vulnerability due to its lack of domestic energy resources, Japan embarked on a comprehensive transformation of its energy and industrial sectors. Conservation became a national priority, and industries adopted cutting-edge technologies to minimize energy use. The government promoted nuclear power, which grew rapidly as a share of Japan's energy mix. These changes helped Japan maintain its competitive edge in global markets and set a model for energy efficiency that would inspire other nations. Yet the oil crisis did not only affect industrialized nations. Developing countries experienced some of the most profound consequences, though their experiences varied widely. Oil-exporting nations saw unprecedented growth in national revenues, enabling large-scale development projects, modernization initiatives, and rising standards of living. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates invested heavily in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. The wealth generated by oil allowed these nations to embark on transformative modernization programs that reshaped their societies and economies. However, developing nations without oil experienced the opposite effect. Rising oil prices strained budgets, increased the cost of imports, and contributed to inflation. Many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America faced worsening economic conditions as their energy expenses soared. To manage these pressures, governments often borrowed heavily from international banks, which were flush with petrodollars. In the short term, this borrowing provided relief, but it sowed the seeds of a debt crisis that would emerge in the 1980s. Thus, the oil crisis played a crucial role in deepening global economic inequalities. While the economic impacts of the crisis were severe, the geopolitical consequences were arguably even more significant. The balance of power in the Middle East shifted as oil-producing nations gained unprecedented influence on the world stage. Saudi Arabia, in particular, emerged as a pivotal actor, not just in OPEC, but in global diplomacy. Its vast oil reserves and its role as a stabilizing force in the global energy system granted it a unique position in international affairs. The United States recognized this shift and sought to strengthen its relationship with Saudi Arabia, establishing a long-term partnership that linked American security guarantees to Saudi commitment to stable oil markets. This relationship would become a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, shaping decisions related to regional conflicts, arms sales, and military deployments. The oil crisis revealed the extent to which the United States, and indeed the world, depended on the stability of the Persian Gulf. Israel's position also changed in the aftermath of the crisis. While the United States continued to support Israel, the shock of the embargo prompted more cautious diplomatic engagement in the region. The crisis underscored the importance of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict to promote regional stability and energy security. This set the stage for diplomatic efforts that would eventually lead to the Camp David Accords in 1978. a landmark peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Although the crisis did not directly create the conditions for this agreement, it contributed to a broader recognition among world leaders of the need for negotiated solutions. At the same time, the Soviet Union sought to expand its influence in the Middle East, capitalizing on the shifting dynamics. Although it provided support to several Arab nations, including Egypt and Syria, the long-term impact of the crisis did not significantly alter the broader Cold War power structure. Nonetheless, the crisis demonstrated that regional conflicts could have global economic consequences, influencing the strategic thinking of both superpowers. The broader cultural impact of the oil crisis cannot be understated. Before 1973, many people in industrialized nations had taken abundant energy for granted. The era was characterized by consumerism, suburban expansion, and a sense of limitless growth. The crisis shattered these illusions, revealing the fragility of the modern energy-dependent lifestyle. Suddenly, consumers were forced to confront the reality of scarcity. For many, the crisis became a symbol of the limits of modern industrial society. The crisis also contributed to the growth of environmental awareness. Although environmental movements had begun earlier, the energy shortages of the 1970s raised new questions about resource consumption, sustainability, and the long-term viability of fossil fuels. Public interest in alternative energy sources grew, and government funding for renewable energy research increased. While these initiatives did not immediately transform the energy landscape, they laid the groundwork for future advancements in solar, wind, and other renewable technologies. Another important outcome of the crisis was the shift in urban planning and transportation policy. Many cities began exploring public transportation improvements to reduce dependence on cars. Interest in mass transit, carpooling, and energy-efficient urban design increased. Although the full realization of these ideas varied across regions, the crisis initiated conversations that would influence urban planning for decades. International institutions also evolved in response to the crisis. The International Energy Agency, created in 1974, became an essential forum for cooperation among oil-importing nations. Its responsibilities included coordinating emergency responses, analyzing market conditions, and promoting energy security. The creation of the IEA signaled a shift toward institutionalized energy governance and greater collaboration among nations facing shared vulnerabilities. As the world adapted to the new energy reality, oil producers and consumers engaged in an ongoing negotiation of power and interests. OPEC continued to play a major role in shaping global oil markets, though internal disagreements sometimes weakened its cohesion. The ability of OPEC to influence prices varied over time, depending on the alignment of member interests and the broader state of global demand. Yet the significance of the 1973 crisis endures not because of any one policy, price change, or political event, but because it revealed the deep interconnections within the global system. It showed that economic stability could be undermined by political decisions thousands of miles away, and that modern societies were vulnerable to disruptions in energy supply. This realization changed how nations approached energy, security, diplomacy, and development. By the late 1970s, the world had begun to settle into an uneasy acceptance of the new energy landscape shaped by the 1973 oil crisis. Though nations had adjusted in various ways, the fundamental vulnerability of the global system was clear. Oil remained the lifeblood of industry, transportation, and modern civilization, but its supply was more precarious than before, and its pricing more volatile. The sudden realization that geopolitical events could disrupt the entire global economy left a lasting psychological imprint on policymakers and citizens alike. Despite the challenges, many governments attempted to respond with measures designed to promote long-term stability. Some of these efforts were successful, while others fell short, but all revealed the complexity of balancing economic growth, energy security, and geopolitical interests in a rapidly changing world. One of the key areas reshaped by the crisis was industrial strategy. Many nations had to reconsider their reliance on energy-intensive industries and reorient their economic priorities. Countries like Japan and West Germany, which were already shifting toward precision manufacturing and high-tech industries, accelerated this transformation. They invested in technologies that reduced energy consumption and enhanced productivity. Over time, these shifts helped them remain globally competitive even as energy costs rose. The United States, on the other hand, faced more difficult adjustments. Throughout the post-war period, American industry had operated with a relative abundance of domestic energy. The automobile culture, suburban expansion, and manufacturing sectors were built on cheap oil and spacious land. When energy prices surged, the structural inefficiencies of this model became more apparent, while the US made efforts to increase energy efficiency and encourage conservation. It struggled with industrial decline in sectors heavily reliant on cheap energy, such as steel and automotive manufacturing. Detroit, in particular, experienced long-term consequences. American automakers had long assumed that consumers preferred large, powerful vehicles, a trend supported by years of inexpensive gasoline. But after 1973, consumer preferences shifted rapidly. Fuel efficiency suddenly mattered. Japanese carmakers like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan offered smaller, more economical models that appealed to consumers facing rising fuel costs. This shift eroded the dominance of American manufacturers and marked the beginning of a more competitive global automotive market. Europe and Japan, both highly dependent on imported oil, placed greater emphasis on public transportation and energy-efficient urban design. European cities expanded their rail networks, improved mass transit systems, and encouraged policies that reduced reliance on automobiles. Japan, operating with limited land and dense urban populations, embraced these trends even more aggressively. These choices had long-term consequences. Decades later, both regions would have more efficient transportation systems compared to countries that continued to prioritize cars. The crisis also accelerated the global conversation about diversification of energy sources. Nuclear power emerged as one of the most prominent alternatives to oil. France, in particular, adopted nuclear energy with exceptional zeal, initiating a massive build-out of reactors that would eventually supply the vast majority of the country's electricity. The French government framed nuclear power as both a technological achievement and a strategic necessity, arguing that energy independence was critical in an increasingly unstable world. Other nations followed similar paths, though not to the same extent. Japan expanded its nuclear program, as did several European nations. The United States, too, saw a surge of interest in nuclear energy during the mid-1970s. However, concerns about safety, waste disposal, and environmental impacts eventually slowed the growth of US nuclear development. Even so, the momentum generated in the wake of the oil crisis established nuclear power as a core component of global energy planning. At the same time, the crisis sparked interest in renewable energy. Though solar and wind technologies were still in early stages of development, governments began funding research programs aimed at reducing the cost of these technologies. Environmentalists, who had long warned about resource depletion and pollution, found new audiences as the energy crisis made sustainability a mainstream issue. While it would take decades for renewable energy to become commercially competitive, the seeds were planted during this period. From a geopolitical perspective, the crisis further cemented the strategic importance of the Middle East. The Persian Gulf, in particular, became a focal point of global security concerns. Western nations stepped up diplomatic and military engagement in the region to ensure stable access to oil supplies. The United States strengthened alliances with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. These relationships involved not only economic cooperation, but also large arms deals, security commitments, and intelligence partnerships. This deepened involvement had long-term implications. The U.S. presence in the Middle East would grow steadily in the decades following the crisis, influencing foreign policy decisions and military strategies. Many of the conflicts, alliances, and interventions that shaped late 20th century geopolitics can be traced back to the strategic shifts initiated during and after the oil crisis. Meanwhile, OPEC emerged as a more prominent force in global affairs. The organization demonstrated that coordinated action by resource-exporting nations could challenge the dominance of traditional industrial powers. Though internal divisions and conflicting national interests sometimes limited OPEC's effectiveness, its influence on global markets remained significant. The events of 1973 also inspired other resource-rich nations around the world to assert greater control over their natural resources. In Latin America, for example, countries such as Mexico and Venezuela nationalized their oil industries, seeking greater sovereignty over production and pricing. In Africa, Nigeria and Libya pursued similar strategies. The idea that natural resources should be controlled by national governments rather than foreign corporations gained intellectual and political legitimacy during this period. This shift contributed to broader discussions about economic independence and development strategies in the global South. Another major consequence of the crisis was the rise of economic nationalism in many countries. Governments sought to protect domestic industries, reduce reliance on foreign imports, and strengthen national control over key sectors. While some countries implemented policies that encouraged innovation and diversification, others pursued more protectionist approaches that, in some cases, hindered long-term growth. The tension between globalization and national economic sovereignty became more pronounced during this period, shaping policy debates that continue to this day. The social consequences of the crisis were also significant. In many industrialized nations, rising prices eroded purchasing power, contributing to declining living standards. Workers faced job losses as industries contracted or restructured. Labor unrest increased as unions demanded higher wages to keep pace with inflation. Governments struggled to balance conflicting social and economic pressures, contributing to political instability in some cases. In the United States, the crisis contributed to a broader sense of national uncertainty. Combined with the Vietnam War, inflation, and the Watergate scandal, the oil crisis reinforced a perception that America was losing its post-war confidence and facing new challenges it was unprepared to meet. The crisis had a psychological impact that extended beyond the immediate economic disruption. In Europe, the crisis influenced political debates about the future of the continent. Some nations turned towards socialist policies aimed at supporting workers and managing economic restructuring. Others embraced market-oriented reforms designed to increase competitiveness. These differing responses reflected the broader ideological tensions that shaped European politics throughout the late 20th century. In the developing world, the crisis intensified debates about economic development and global inequality. Many nations argued that the international economic system was unfairly tilted in favor of industrialized countries. The surge in oil prices created new alliances among resource-exporting nations, who sought to use their natural assets to negotiate more favorable terms in global markets. The concept of a new international economic order, which aimed to restructure global trade and financial relationships, gained momentum during this period, though its goals were only partially realized. The crisis also forced a rethinking of long-term economic planning. Governments and corporations alike recognized that they needed to anticipate future disruptions and develop contingency strategies. Scenario planning, risk assessment, and long-term forecasting became more sophisticated. Many of the modern tools used in strategic planning, from computer modeling to geopolitical risk analysis, were refined or developed in the years following the crisis. As the 1970s progressed, the world experienced a second major oil shock in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution. This second crisis reinforced many of the lessons learned during the first and underscored the ongoing volatility of global energy markets. While the 1973 crisis was a wake-up call, the 1979 crisis confirmed that the world had entered a new era in which energy security would remain a central concern. As the 1970s came to an end, the echoes of the 1973 oil crisis still reverberated across global systems. Economies had transformed, geopolitical alliances had shifted, and nations had begun rethinking everything from industrial priorities to foreign policy strategies. Yet, in many ways, the crisis remained unfinished business. Its consequences continued to unfold throughout the late 20th century, shaping international relations, economic trends, and energy strategies for decades to come. To appreciate the full magnitude of the crisis, it is essential to explore not only immediate responses, but also the long arc of transformation it set into motion. One of the clearest areas of long-term impact was the restructuring of national economies. In the years following the crisis, industrialized nations increasingly shifted away from heavy manufacturing and towards services, technology, and financial sectors. While this transition had begun earlier, the oil crisis accelerated it by making energy-intensive industries less competitive. In the United States, for instance, the decline of manufacturing hubs in the Midwest, later known as the Rust Belt, can be partially traced to the economic pressures triggered by rising energy costs. Factories that relied on cheap fuel suddenly faced higher production expenses. Automation, globalization, and shifts in consumer demand compounded these challenges. As companies sought lower costs abroad, offshoring became more common, leading to job losses in traditional industries. The aftermath of the oil crisis thus played a role in reshaping the geography of economic opportunity, contributing to political, social, and demographic changes that would unfold over subsequent decades. In Western Europe, similar transformations occurred. Nations like the United Kingdom grappled with declining coal and manufacturing sectors. Economic restructuring became a central political issue, fueling debates over privatization, labor rights, and economic liberalization. Leadership changes reflected these tensions, with Margaret Thatcher's rise in the UK symbolizing a broader shift toward market-driven policies. While the causes of these shifts were complex, the energy crisis provided a significant impetus for governments to rethink their economic roles and priorities. Japan, on the other hand, managed the transition with remarkable success. Its focus on energy efficiency and high-tech manufacturing allowed it to thrive despite global volatility. By investing in electronics, automotive engineering, robotics, and precision manufacturing, Japan positioned itself at the forefront of global technological leadership. These industries required far less energy per unit of output, allowing Japan to maintain economic growth even as energy costs remained high. The crisis thus helped reinforce Japan's long-standing strategic emphasis on innovation, efficiency, and disciplined long-term planning. Another major consequence of the oil crisis was the emergence of energy security as a central national priority. Nations recognized that reliance on foreign oil, especially from politically volatile regions, posed significant risks. As a result, energy policy shifted from being purely economic to explicitly strategic. Governments began treating energy infrastructure as essential to national security, developing contingency plans and diversifying supply sources. For the United States, this shift was momentous. The concept of energy independence became a recurring theme in political discourse. Policymakers debated how best to achieve it, whether through increased domestic production, alternative energy development, conservation, or expanded reserves. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, established in the mid-1970s, became a cornerstone of U.S. energy security, providing a stockpile of crude oil that could be deployed during future crises. Although achieving full energy independence proved elusive, the efforts spurred domestic innovation in areas such as offshore drilling, shale oil exploration, and energy efficiency standards. In Western Europe, energy security took on a more cooperative character. The creation of the International Energy Agency marked a major step toward collective action. Member nations agreed to maintain strategic reserves, share information, and coordinate responses to supply disruptions. This institution played a critical role in stabilizing markets, advising governments, and fostering international dialogue on energy issues. The emphasis on cooperation reflected Europe's recognition that no single nation could address energy vulnerabilities alone. The oil crisis also had profound implications for global finance. The vast revenues accumulated by oil-exporting nations were deposited in Western banks, creating large pools of capital known as petrodollars. These funds needed to be reinvested, and banks, eager to capitalize on the opportunity, increased lending to developing nations. While this initially stimulated growth in parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, it also created unsustainable debt burdens that became evident in the 1980s. When global interest rates rose sharply as part of efforts to control inflation, many developing nations faced severe financial crises. This dynamic revealed the interconnectedness of global economic systems. A change in one sector, in this case, oil pricing, could reverberate through banking institutions, government budgets, and international development efforts. The crisis thus played a role in highlighting the vulnerabilities of newly globalized financial markets and contributed to later reforms in international lending practices, debt restructuring, and economic governance. Within oil-producing nations, the consequences were equally transformative. The sudden influx of wealth into countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates spurred rapid modernization, fueled urban development, and altered social structures. Entire cities were redesigned. Education systems expanded. Healthcare improved. Infrastructure projects reshaped the landscape. But the rapid pace of change also introduced tensions, including disparities in wealth distribution, shifts in traditional cultural patterns, and reliance on foreign labor. The oil crisis also strengthened nationalization movements within the energy sector. Countries that had previously relied on foreign companies to manage their oil resources sought greater sovereignty. National oil companies emerged as powerful institutions, controlling everything from exploration and production to marketing and export. This shift reduced the influence of Western oil majors and redistributed control over oil wealth. It also reflected broader themes of post-colonial independence and economic empowerment. However, the rapid rise in wealth also created new challenges. Economies that became heavily dependent on oil revenues often struggled to diversify. This vulnerability would become apparent in later decades, as fluctuations in oil prices led to cycles of boom and bust. Some nations responded with long-term planning and investment in sovereign wealth funds, while others faced difficulties managing the volatility of global markets. The legacies of these choices continue to influence the political and economic trajectories of oil-rich nations today. The 1973 oil crisis also contributed to a broader ideological shift in global economics. The stagflation of the 1970s undermined confidence in Keynesian economics, which had guided policy in the post-war era. In response, new economic theories gained prominence, including monetarism, deregulation, and market liberalization. These ideas would influence the policies of leaders such as Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. While the oil crisis was not the sole cause of this ideological transformation, it played a critical role by exposing weaknesses in existing economic frameworks and fueling the search for alternatives. The environmental movement also gained momentum in the aftermath of the crisis. Prior to 1973, environmental concerns had focused largely on pollution, conservation, and wildlife protection. The oil crisis added new dimensions to these concerns by highlighting the risks of resource depletion, the fragility of energy systems, and the need for sustainable alternatives. Governments began funding research into renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, geothermal, and hydroelectric power. Although these technologies would take decades to mature, the crisis planted the seeds of what would eventually become a global shift toward sustainability. Public attitudes toward energy consumption also began to change. The idea that resources were finite and could be disrupted by geopolitical events encouraged a more cautious and conservation-minded approach. Consumer awareness campaigns emphasized actions such as turning down thermostats, reducing vehicle use, and improving home insulation. While these changes varied by region, they marked an important cultural shift toward more mindful energy use. Another long-term impact of the crisis was the renewed importance of geopolitics in everyday economic life. The events of 1973 demonstrated that global economic stability depended on political decisions made in distant regions. Suddenly, conflicts in the Middle East had direct consequences for consumers in the United States, Europe, and beyond. This realization contributed to a heightened interest in foreign affairs, security issues, and diplomatic relations. Citizens and policymakers alike became more attuned to global interdependence, for better or worse. By reshaping global perceptions of vulnerability and power, the crisis helped define the contours of late 20th century geopolitics. It contributed to the long-term U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf. It influenced alliances within the Middle East. It elevated the strategic significance of the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Hormuz, choke points through which a significant portion of the world's oil passed. Control or disruption of these routes became central issues in international security planning. The crisis also influenced cultural narratives. Films, books, and media coverage of the era reflected a growing sense of uncertainty about the future. Themes of scarcity, inflation, and energy dependence appeared frequently in public discourse. The image of long lines at gas stations became an enduring symbol of the vulnerability of modern society. These images would later inform debates about climate change, sustainability, and the future of global development. By the early 1980s, the world had undergone profound transformations that could be traced back to the events of 1973. Economies had restructured, energy policies had shifted, geopolitical alliances had been reshaped. Yet, despite these changes, the fundamental lesson of the crisis remained clear. Energy is the foundation of modern civilization, and its disruption carries consequences that extend far beyond economics. As the world moved deeper into the 1980s, the long shadow of the 1973 oil crisis continued to influence economic policy, geopolitical behavior, and global energy strategy. Although nearly a decade had passed, governments and corporations were still adapting to the realities the crisis had exposed. Some nations had taken decisive steps toward energy diversification and efficiency, while others struggled with debt, instability, or over-reliance on oil revenues. The crisis had not only reshaped the present, it had fundamentally redefined the trajectory of the future. One of the clearest long-term consequences was the persistent volatility of oil prices. Before 1973, prices had remained relatively stable for decades. But after the crisis, volatility became the norm. The global oil market had transformed into a far more unpredictable environment, influenced by political upheaval, economic cycles, and the decisions of OPEC. Markets no longer assumed that supply would remain constant. Instead, traders, companies, and governments began tracking political developments in oil-producing regions with unprecedented attention. This shift toward volatility had profound implications for global financial markets. Commodities trading expanded significantly as investors sought to hedge against uncertainty or capitalize on price fluctuations. New financial instruments emerged, including futures contracts, options, and derivatives tied to energy prices. These tools helped stabilize markets in some cases, but added layers of complexity that introduced new risks. The integration of oil into global finance represented a major shift, reflecting the growing interdependence between energy markets and the global economy. Meanwhile, the lessons of the crisis continue to shape policy decisions in industrialized nations. In the United States, several administrations attempted to address energy dependency with varying degrees of success. Efforts to promote domestic production, support alternative energy, and regulate fuel efficiency sometimes clashed with political opposition, market pressures, or short-term economic concerns. Although some progress was made, especially in increasing fuel economy standards, the goal of achieving true energy independence remained elusive. Europe, by contrast, moved more decisively toward diversification. The North Sea oil fields, discovered earlier in the century, entered full production, providing significant supplies to the United Kingdom and Norway. These resources helped reduce Europe's reliance on Middle Eastern oil and provided a measure of stability in times of crisis. At the same time, France continued its massive investment in nuclear energy. By the late 1980s, the country had become the world leader in nuclear power generation, a status it still retains. This strategic choice helped shield France from some of the energy shocks that affected other nations. Japan, too, maintained its focus on efficiency and innovation. Its industries continued to refine manufacturing processes to reduce energy consumption, producing some of the most advanced technologies in automobiles, electronics, and robotics. Japan's approach to energy became a model for other nations seeking to balance growth with vulnerability. Even today, the legacy of the crisis can be seen in Japan's highly efficient energy infrastructure and long-term planning culture. For developing nations, however, the situation was far more complicated. Many countries had borrowed heavily during the 1970s to cope with rising oil prices, finance development, or stabilize their economies. When interest rates rose in the early 1980s, part of a global effort to combat inflation, many nations found themselves unable to service their debts. This debt crisis had severe consequences, leading to austerity measures, economic contraction, and social unrest across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. The oil crisis, indirectly, had contributed to one of the most significant global financial challenges of the late 20th century. At the same time, oil-producing nations faced their own challenges. Although revenues had surged in the 1970s, the early 1980s brought new uncertainties. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 triggered a second major oil shock, reinforcing global fears about supply instability. However, the boom in prices encouraged increased production not only in OPEC nations, but also in non-OPEC countries, including the United States, Britain, Norway, Mexico, and others. As global supply increased, prices eventually fell in the mid-1980s, creating budgetary challenges for oil-dependent nations. This boom-and-bust cycle revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in economies heavily reliant on a single resource. Nations such as Nigeria, Venezuela, and Algeria began experiencing economic difficulties as prices dropped. Without diversified economies, they struggled to manage the swings in revenue. This dynamic remains a central challenge for many oil-producing nations today, underscoring the lasting legacy of the crisis. Another significant consequence of the oil crisis was its influence on political ideologies and governance. The stagflation of the 1970s, triggered in part by the oil shocks, undermined confidence in government intervention and Keynesian economic models. As inflation soared and unemployment remained high, many people questioned whether traditional policies were effective. This erosion of trust contributed to the rise of neoliberal ideologies advocating deregulation, privatization, and reduced government involvement in the economy. Leaders such as Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom embodied this ideological shift. They promoted market-oriented reforms, arguing that excessive regulation and government spending had contributed to economic stagnation. While the oil crisis was not the sole cause of these political transformations, it played a critical role in shaping the economic environment that allowed such ideas to gain traction. These shifts would influence global economic policy for decades, contributing to the rise of globalization, financial deregulation, and free market economics. In the Middle East, the crisis had equally profound effects. The sudden influx of oil wealth transformed societies rapidly, leading to modernization, urbanization, and social change. Governments used oil revenues to fund infrastructure projects, expand education, and provide social services. Yet the rapid pace of development also created tensions between tradition and modernization. Cultural identities were reshaped as foreign workers arrived to support construction and industry. The demographic changes introduced by this influx would have long-term effects on the social fabric of the Gulf states. Moreover, the crisis increased the strategic significance of the Persian Gulf. The region became a focal point of global security concerns, not only because of its oil reserves, but also because of the geopolitical rivalries surrounding it. Conflicts such as the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, threatened global oil supplies and underscored the fragility of regional stability. Major powers, especially the United States, became increasingly involved in the region's security, a trend that would intensify in the decades that followed. The legacy of the 1973 oil crisis can also be seen in the environmental movement, which gained momentum as concerns about resource depletion, pollution, and sustainability grew. Although the crisis itself was primarily economic and geopolitical, it prompted many people to rethink humanity's relationship with natural resources. Environmental groups argued that reliance on finite fossil fuels was unsustainable and that societies needed to transition to cleaner, renewable energy sources. Governments began establishing environmental regulations, promoting energy conservation, and funding research into alternatives. These efforts laid the groundwork for later debates about climate change and sustainability. While the scientific understanding of climate change was still developing during the 1970s, the crisis helped bring environmental issues into mainstream political discourse. It emphasized the importance of long-term planning, resource management, and technological innovation in addressing global challenges. Perhaps one of the most enduring lessons of the crisis was the recognition of global interdependence. The events of 1973 demonstrated that no nation, regardless of its wealth or power, could insulate itself from disruptions in the global energy system. The crisis underscored the interconnectedness of economies and the need for cooperation in addressing shared vulnerabilities. This understanding contributed to the development of international institutions, strategic alliances, and coordinated policies that continue to shape the global energy landscape today. Culturally, the crisis left a lasting imprint. Images of gas lines, rationing, and economic hardship became symbols of a moment when modern society confronted the limits of its own growth. These images were etched into the public consciousness, influencing everything from political rhetoric to popular culture. Even decades later, the crisis continues to serve as a reference point in discussions about energy, economics, and geopolitical risk. By the end of the 20th century, the world had largely adapted to the new energy realities introduced by the crisis. Markets had become more sophisticated, governments more strategic, and societies more aware of the importance of sustainable resource management. Yet the fundamental vulnerabilities exposed by the crisis had not disappeared. Instead, they had become embedded in global systems, shaping how nations approached questions of energy security, economic planning, and international relations. As the 20th century progressed, the legacy of the 1973 oil crisis continued to shape economic decisions, political strategies, and global energy developments. Even though the immediate panic of the crisis had faded, its lessons were deeply ingrained in the minds of policymakers, economists, industries, and the public. It had become one of the great turning points of the modern era, comparable to the Great Depression or the end of World War II, in the way it forced nations to reconsider the foundations of their societies. One of the most important transformations that emerged from the crisis was the redefinition of the global energy market itself. Before 1973, oil production and pricing had been largely controlled by Western oil companies, with producing nations acting primarily as suppliers within a system they did not fully control. After the crisis, however, the balance shifted decisively toward the producing nations. OPEC became a central actor in global markets, setting production quotas and influencing prices in ways that had once seemed impossible. Although OPEC did not always act with complete unity, the organization had demonstrated that coordinated action could shape the global economy. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. Nations that had once been considered peripheral suddenly found themselves at the center of world affairs. Their decisions affected everything from consumer prices to military strategy. The crisis also inspired other resource-rich nations to assert greater control over their natural assets, contributing to a broader movement toward economic sovereignty and nationalization. This change had lasting ripple effects. Multinational corporations, recognizing the shifting dynamics, began developing new strategies for dealing with resource-rich countries. They entered into joint ventures, negotiated more balanced contracts, and, in some cases, restructured their entire business models to adapt to the new geopolitical realities. This marked a transition away from the colonial-era relationships that had dominated the resource industries in earlier decades. The crisis also influenced the development of new technologies. The rise of offshore drilling in the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and elsewhere was partly driven by the need to diversify global supply. As prices rose, previously uneconomical fields became viable. Investment poured into technologies that allowed drilling in deeper waters, harsher climates, and more remote regions. These innovations would eventually reshape the global supply map and reduce OPEC's ability to control markets as effectively as it had in 1973. Another major technological shift influenced by the crisis was the gradual evolution of renewable energy. While substantial progress would not be made until decades later, the crisis planted the seeds of research and investment. Governments realized that relying too heavily on fossil fuels, especially those sourced from geopolitically unstable regions, posed long-term risks. Universities, research institutions, and private companies began exploring the potential of solar and wind energy. Although these technologies were expensive and limited at the time, the intellectual and economic groundwork laid during this period would eventually drive the global renewable revolution of the 21st century. In addition to technological changes, The crisis influenced global consciousness about the environment. Concepts like sustainability, conservation, and ecological responsibility gained traction. People began to understand that energy was not just an economic commodity, but a finite resource with environmental consequences. This awareness helped shape future debates about climate change and resource management. Yet the crisis did not only prompt technological and environmental shifts. It also altered the geopolitical landscape in ways that would resonate for decades. The strategic importance of the Persian Gulf grew immensely. The United States, recognizing the necessity of securing stable oil supplies, strengthened its military and diplomatic presence in the region. This increased engagement would play a major role in later foreign policy decisions, including military operations and long-term security partnerships. The crisis also influenced the internal dynamics of Middle Eastern nations. Rapid modernization created both opportunities and tensions. Wealth-funded infrastructure projects expanded social services and improved quality of life. But it also created dependencies, exposed economic vulnerabilities, and fueled debates about modernization, tradition, and national identity. The social transformations unleashed during this period would help shape regional politics well into the 21st century. The Global South, meanwhile, faced a different set of challenges. Nations without oil wealth struggled under the burden of rising energy costs and mounting debt. Many governments attempted to industrialize rapidly to offset economic pressures, taking on loans that became unsustainable when global interest rates rose. The crisis thus indirectly contributed to widespread financial instability across the developing world. This instability, in turn, influenced political movements, economic reforms, and social transformations that reshaped entire regions. Culturally, the oil crisis altered how societies viewed consumption, mobility, and technological progress. Before 1973, the world had embraced an ethos of abundance, cheap fuel, cheap travel, and seemingly endless economic growth. The crisis shattered that illusion. Long lines at gas stations became a symbol of vulnerability. The idea that everyday life could be disrupted so suddenly left a psychological mark that lasted for generations. In the arts, literature, and media, themes of scarcity, dependency, and uncertainty became more common. Films about dystopian futures and resource conflicts gained popularity. Economic and political satire incorporated references to inflation, oil shortages, and government policy failures. Public debates about the future of society increasingly referenced the crisis as a turning point that revealed the limits of growth and the fragility of modern systems. The crisis also influenced demographic and social patterns. In some countries, the economic instability contributed to shifts in employment, migration, and urban development. People moved in search of new opportunities as industries restructured. Suburban expansion slowed in some regions where commuting costs increased. Cities invested more in mass transit, bicycle infrastructure, and pedestrian-friendly planning. Though these changes varied by location, they reflected a broader shift in how societies thought about mobility, space, and energy consumption. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the legacy of the oil crisis continued to shape policy debates. In the United States, discussions about energy independence became recurring themes in presidential campaigns. Politicians frequently referenced 1973 as a cautionary tale, arguing for greater domestic production or alternative energy investments. Although political consensus was often difficult to achieve, the memory of the crisis kept energy policy high on the national agenda. In Europe, integration deepened as nations recognized that cooperation was essential for managing shared vulnerabilities. Energy became a key focus of European policymaking, influencing everything from environmental standards to infrastructure investments. The European Union, building on earlier institutions, began developing long-term strategies for energy security, emissions reductions, and technological innovation. Around the world, governments began thinking more strategically about energy in general. Countries like China and India, emerging as major global powers, realized that economic growth would depend on reliable access to energy. They sought partnerships, secured long-term contracts, and invested in domestic production. The rise of these emerging economies added new dimensions to global energy competition and cooperation. The crisis also shaped long-term patterns of military strategy. The presence of foreign militaries in the Middle East increased significantly after 1973, driven largely by the need to safeguard vital energy routes. The Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and various pipelines became strategic assets. Naval deployments, regional alliances, and arms agreements were influenced by the need to ensure oil could continue flowing to global markets. These strategic calculations would influence international relations well into the 21st century. Looking back, one of the most striking aspects of the crisis is how deeply it affected so many different aspects of society. It was not simply an economic event or a geopolitical conflict. It touched culture, psychology, technology, finance, diplomacy, industry, and the environment. It reshaped consumer behavior, altered urban landscapes, and inspired new political movements. It challenged assumptions about growth, security, and stability that had defined the post-war era. Even today, decades after the crisis, its influence remains visible. Modern energy debates, from concerns about fossil fuel dependency to the push for renewables, still reference the lessons of 1973. The crisis demonstrated that energy cannot be separated from geopolitics, economics, or the environment. It revealed that global systems are interconnected and that disruptions in one area can have cascading effects worldwide. But the story is not complete yet. To fully capture the scope of the crisis, we must now explore how these long-term consequences shape the transition into the 21st century. We must examine how the lessons of 1973 influenced later energy crises, technological breakthroughs, and geopolitical shifts. And finally, we will bring the narrative to a concluding chapter that reflects on the full legacy of the crisis, along with the final message you requested for audience engagement. As the world entered the 21st century, the legacy of the 1973 oil crisis continued to shape international economics and geopolitics in ways that often went unnoticed, yet were profoundly influential. The crisis had taken place nearly 3 decades earlier, yet its imprint could be detected in reactions to subsequent oil shocks, energy policies, strategic alliances, and even the daily habits of billions of people. It had reshaped the architecture of the global system, influencing not only how nations produced and consumed energy, but how they perceived their vulnerabilities and opportunities. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of the crisis's enduring influence was the world's reaction to later energy disruptions. When wars, revolutions, or natural disasters affected oil supplies in the 21st century, governments and markets were quicker to respond, better equipped with strategic reserves, and more aware of the interconnected nature of global energy flows. The crisis had taught nations that preparedness was essential, and that even a temporary supply disruption could have cascading economic consequences. This awareness was particularly evident during the early 2000s, when rising oil demand from emerging economies such as China and India exerted upward pressure on prices. As global demand increased, analysts often reference the lessons of 1973 to warn of potential vulnerabilities. Companies began investing more aggressively in alternative energy, unconventional oil extraction, and more fuel-efficient technologies. Governments monitored geopolitical developments in the Middle East and other producing regions with heightened vigilance, understanding that their economies were tied to forces far beyond their borders. The legacy of the crisis could also be seen in the structure of modern energy markets. The futures markets that emerged partly because of the crisis became integral to how oil was bought and sold around the world. These markets, though complex, provided mechanisms for hedging risk and stabilizing supply chains. The crisis had, in effect, accelerated the financialization of energy, intertwining it with global capital flows in ways that profoundly influenced international economics. In addition, the crisis helped catalyze long-term technological advancements that reshaped the global energy landscape. The early investments in solar and wind power, motivated by fears of fossil fuel scarcity, eventually blossomed into major industries. Although renewables took many decades to become cost-competitive, their growth in the late 20th and early 21st centuries can be traced back to the initial push sparked by the oil crisis. Today, renewable energy plays a central role in global energy strategies, with nations pursuing ambitious goals for wind farms, solar arrays, and energy storage systems. The automotive industry, transformed by the crisis, continued evolving long after the lines at gas stations had disappeared. Companies around the world invested in engines with greater fuel efficiency, hybrids, and eventually electric vehicles. Consumer preferences shifted toward energy-efficient models, especially during periods of rising fuel prices. These trends, set in motion by the crisis, played a crucial role in shaping today's transportation infrastructure and technological priorities. Another enduring legacy of the crisis lies in its influence on climate and environmental policy. Although climate change had not yet entered mainstream political discourse in 1973, the crisis heightened awareness about the dangers of over-reliance on finite resources. This awareness helped lay the intellectual foundation for the sustainability movements that gained strength in the 1990s and beyond. Many of the debates about carbon emissions, renewable energy, and environmental protection can trace their origins to the consciousness shift that began with the oil crisis. The geopolitical implications of the crisis continued to reverberate through the early 21st century as well. The United States deepened its involvement in the Middle East throughout the late 20th century and into the new millennium, a process partly shaped by the strategic importance of the region's oil reserves. Conflicts, alliances, diplomatic negotiations, and military interventions were influenced by the need to maintain stable access to energy resources. The crisis had revealed how critical the region was to the functioning of the global economy, and that realization shaped foreign policy for decades. In the Persian Gulf states, the wealth generated by oil revenues funded massive development projects, cultural institutions, and modernization efforts. Entire cities transformed into global hubs for finance, tourism, and commerce. The rapid evolution of places like Dubai and Doha cannot be separated from the economic momentum initiated by the oil crisis. While these nations had always possessed significant reserves, the realization of oil's geopolitical power after 1973 accelerated their development and global influence. Yet the crisis had also exposed the risks of over-reliance on oil. Some producing nations attempted to diversify their economies, while others struggled to escape the volatility of global oil prices. Economic booms were often followed by painful downturns when prices fell. This cycle of prosperity and contraction became a defining characteristic of many oil-dependent states. The challenge of diversification remains unresolved for many of them even today. In many developing nations that lacked oil reserves, the crisis left a legacy of debt, economic instability, and difficult choices about energy strategy. Rising oil prices had strained national budgets during the 1970s, and the loans taken to cope with these pressures became crippling burdens in later decades. The crisis thus contributed indirectly to global inequalities that continue to shape international development patterns. While these economic and political consequences were enormous, the social and cultural legacy of the crisis was equally significant. In the decades that followed, the crisis became a symbol of the fragility of modern society. It was a reminder that technological progress and economic growth could be undermined by resource constraints, geopolitical tensions, or policy failures. The crisis dispelled the illusion of perpetual abundance and forced societies to confront the reality that modern life depended on complex and vulnerable systems. This awareness shaped behaviors and expectations for generations. People became more conscious of energy consumption, more aware of global interdependence, and more attuned to the risks of geopolitical conflict. It influenced educational curricula, public debate, and cultural narratives. Even today, when energy shortages or fuel price spikes occur, they are often compared to the events of 1973 as a reference point for understanding their potential impact. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the crisis is how it reshaped the relationship between nations. Before 1973, the global energy system had been one-sided, dominated by producers of industrial goods and the Western oil companies that controlled extraction. The crisis shifted power toward producing nations, creating a more multipolar world in which influence was more widely distributed. This transformation was not temporary. It changed the structural foundations of the global economy. In many ways, the crisis accelerated the transition from the post-World War Roman II system toward the more interconnected, competitive, and multipolar world of the 21st century. It revealed the limits of Western hegemony, highlighted the power of coordinated action among developing nations, and forced a re-evaluation of long-standing international hierarchies. The crisis played a significant role in shaping the global order that exists today. As we reach the conclusion of this documentary narrative, it becomes clear that the 1973 oil crisis was not simply an economic event or a temporary disruption. It was a watershed moment, one that transformed the global system in ways that still echo through the corridors of power, the structure of economies, and the daily lives of people around the world. It reshaped industries, inspired new technologies, and fundamentally altered the relationships between nations. It was a moment when the world realized that energy, economics, and geopolitics were inseparably linked. And as we consider the challenges of the modern world, from climate change to geopolitical conflict, from economic inequality to technological transformation, we can see that many of the questions we face today were first illuminated by the events of 1973. The crisis taught the world to plan, to anticipate, to innovate, and to adapt. It revealed vulnerabilities, but it also revealed the capacity for resilience and cooperation. The history of the 1973 oil crisis reminds us that global systems are dynamic, that power shifts over time, and that the decisions of nations and individuals can shape the future in profound ways. Understanding this crisis is not merely an exercise in reflecting on the past. It is a way of understanding the present and preparing for the challenges that lie ahead. And with that, we conclude this documentary script. Thank you for listening to this long-form exploration of how the 1973 oil crisis reshaped global economics and geopolitics. If you enjoyed this documentary, be sure to subscribe, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Your support helps bring more documentaries like this to life, and we truly appreciate every one of you who joins us on this journey. More historical explorations, geopolitical analyses, and long-form narratives are on the way, so don't forget to follow and stay connected.